Welcome to the Institute for Management Studies Leadership Conversations podcast, where we have leading thought leaders discussing their research and identifying ways that you can incorporate it to take your learning and development to the next level. Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast that highlights relevant research and practical applications from esteemed leadership experts. Today, I am joined by best-selling author and leading leadership thought leader, Dr. David Burkus, as we are discussing his research and insights from his latest book, Leading from Anywhere, The Essential Guide to Managing Remote Teams. Thanks for joining me, David.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I look forward to sharing and hearing from some of these best practices from your latest book. But before I begin, I want to let everyone know a little bit about your background. David's one of the world's leading business thinkers. He's a best-selling author of 4 books about business and leadership. His books have won multiple awards and have been translated into dozens of languages. His insights on leadership and teamwork have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, USA Today, to name but a few. In 2017, Dr. David Burkus has been ranked as one of the world's top business thought leaders by the Thinkers 50. And as a sought-after international speaker, his TED Talk has been viewed over 2 million times, and he has worked with leaders from organizations across all industries, including Google, Fidelity, Viacom, and even the US Naval Academy. He's also spent 6 years as a full-time business school professor. The thing that he appreciates most about that experience is the eyes moment, where the insight is delivered and the takeaway is there and people just get it. His overriding goal for the last decade is to get everyone to do their best work. And I love how he states that his overriding drive is to get that evidence-based research and ideas out of the ivory tower and into the corner office where work gets done. So maybe, David, you can give us a little more insight about how your journey transpired from business school professor to thought leader, and we can then move into topics about your new book.
Yeah. You know, I realize I probably need to update that saying, actually, given how few people are still in that corner office, right? Right. I guess now it's more like the spare bedroom or the coffee shop or something like that. So, you know, I often say I'm an organizational psychologist by training and a writer and a speaker and a trainer by passion. What not a lot of people know is that the writer side actually came first. I was an undergrad English major. Like, I grew up wanting to make books, wanting to contribute to that field in some way. And it was only when I was a senior that I took a couple elective classes and also fell in love with what I didn't even know it was organizational psychology at the time. It was just like the stuff around psychology where people weren't crazy, right? That led into doing a master's degree just to learn more about it, maybe see what was there. And then I married at the time. I mean, I'm still married, but she was a medical student turned doctor. So we had a lot of study dates. And so when my master's program ran out, I just kept going. Otherwise, I don't know what we would have done because we wouldn't have been able to study together. And so that kind of snowballed into the academic career. But the goal was always actually to do the opposite, right? The academics was almost a detour. The goal was to do that dragging of ideas out of the ivory tower and drag them into wherever they can be helpful. I think a lot of management researchers, and you would think this would be one of the easiest to apply your insights field, but even in these fields, a lot of management researchers write for an audience of maybe 13 other academics who are going to read that paper. And in reality, there's great stuff in there, most of it, and it takes a little bit of translation, somebody who's actually doing that. So I've just been fascinated with doing that for the better part of, I mean, almost 2 decades now. And it's been, you know, it's been really fun to see, like you said, it's been fun to see the eyes moment, even in adult students or folks who attend my speeches and that sort of stuff of like, oh, this model finally explains why this thing works, right? It's really fun to see.
Well, I agree with you when you say, because I've heard you say this before too, that there's a lot of great business school professors and researchers out there, and there are a lot of great storytellers, right? But there's not a whole lot of individuals that can do both effectively. To find someone that can find that relevant research and put it into a compelling story so it's easier to remember. So I love that approach with you, and how do you identify that, right? So that you can identify the right story for the right mix. Is there a skill to that? Is there ways to practice that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have to have a pretty steep grounding in the research first, right? Like, and what you see when you talk to most academics is they'll research a model. Like, let's say Amy Edmondson's model of psychological safety, for example. Brilliant theory, tons of research on it. And yet there are all these examples throughout business history of leaders who led with less of a command and control style and more of a collaborative team style, that nobody makes that connection between the two, right? So you have to have a good grounding in that research. But the truth is, you also just have to be constantly scanning for all of those different stories or possible illustrations. Because most of the time when they come on your radar, they don't come up as stories of whatever model they're trying to explain. Most of the time, if you find in the real world a great example of this, it's not because they knew about the model and sought to apply it. It's they just started trying certain stuff out, right? Like I'll give you a great example. In the newest book, we talk about a story from almost 20 years ago now, the Belgian Ministry of Social Security. Their leader, new leader, Frank van Massenhove, led from a place of sort of trust and autonomy. And there's this whole body of research around self-determination theory that suggests why that works better and why giving people more autonomy over their schedule and that sort of stuff works better. He didn't know any of that, right? So you have to be scanning to sort of see that and then make that connection between it. And when you can do that, for me at least, I'm nerdy like that. When you can do that, things get really fun, right? And I don't think either party, the practitioner party or the scholar party, does it enough. So I'm really excited to kind of have one foot in both worlds to be able to make those connections.
I couldn't agree with you more. And seeing the number of thought leaders that I do, it's rare to find that. And that really, I think, what goes a long way in helping to differentiate your brand. So let's move into your latest book in this research around remote teams. And when we talk about remote work and teams today, what should our frame of reference be for the official start date of this?
Yeah, well, for most of us, the start date is probably March 15th, 2020, give or take a day, right? That's when the great work from home experiment began as a response to COVID. But the truth is, remote work in some capacity has been around for centuries, right? In the United States, you can trace it back to the beginning of the computer revolution. But let's just be honest about something first. Like I remember reading about the British East India, tea company, trading company. That was a remote work organization. Now, granted, the communication lines were really slow, right? Like 3 to 6 months, but you develop systems to keep that in bounds. And you have to, so we've been doing it for a long time. It certainly hasn't been the norm. And in fact, even as it progressed, it always feels like it's maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back as it progressed. Like I said, in the United States, in the knowledge work economy, we kind of saw it beginning in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. I think it was Jack Niels around the 1970s that saw the computer as being able to solve, honestly, he saw it as a transportation issue, not really a work-life balance thing. Whatever his idea was, rather than have everybody commute for 90 minutes into downtown New York, just make little headquarters on the peripheries of big cities and let them commute into that and telecommute into said home office. By the 80s and 90s, you had fax machines and those brick cell phones. Do you remember those? And people starting to say, oh, we really could do this from anywhere. But no one was willing to try it, right? Even in the early 2000s, you'd see examples of companies that would try it. And then a different leader would come in and go, no. If I can't see you, I don't know you're working. Let's all come back, right? It wasn't until it really forced our hand that we kind of tapped into the idea that, okay, this is doable. And in fact, like I said, it's been being done for centuries now. We just kind of haven't recognized it, or we haven't recognized that we have the potential to do it as well.
Well, yeah, and it's been kind of moving ahead at a crawl pace, right? I mean, a very slow pace until I think I pulled a survey from your book, back in 2018, only 3% of the workforce reported that they worked half their hours remotely.
Yeah.
And then fast forward now to 2020, it's a whole nother game, right? A whole nother story. And during the pandemic, surveys found that more than half the employees now want to work remotely, and that to be their primary method of working. And I think even 75% said they would like the option to continue working remotely at least some of the time after this is over. So many companies are trying to follow suit with this new trend. And when you look at the research, though, with the remote workers and team, and there's a lot of research to support why they're more productive, right, than office-bound employees. What are some of the things that you found? Because I know in your book, you also talk about that famous experiment back in 2014 with C-Trip.
Yeah.
On how they started that process. But what have you found from what you've seen in regards, are they more productive at home? If so, why, or are they not?
Yeah. So, the C-Trip experiment, that's a good one to start with. The C-Trip experiment, which is essentially, C-Trip is a Chinese company. One of their founders was also in an MBA program, and the main researcher in the MBA program. They kind of came up with this idea for his senior thesis or his capstone thesis to do this project of their own remote workers. What they found was really interesting. So by and large, people that got randomized into the remote work condition were more productive than the people who were at the office. And there were a couple different reasons for this that actually track with most remote individual employees, right? I mean, the biggest is the lack of distractions and the hours. So they're less distracted by coworkers, that dreaded open office and all of that sort of stuff. But also they tend to start work earlier, right? So they tend to start work when the commute starts. They tend to keep working until they would have returned from said commute. And that adds up to 30 minutes to an hour more work, just more time staring at the screen, right? Now, I know it doesn't feel like that over the last 2 years for most of us, because we've been kind of trying to balance all of this different stuff. If you're in a situation where your kids were Zoom schooling, for example, you just had it felt like maybe you were living at work because you had to squeeze it in wherever else you could, right? But this is BC, before Corona. They tended to work that way. Now, the interesting thing is the second phase of that study had them, and that really was after the initial data was complete. They decided, okay, based on this data, we're going to have a remote work program, but we're going to give some people the option to come back if you tried it and hated it and you want to come back to the office. And if you were in the office and you want to try remote work, and the productivity numbers went up even more. In other words, if I'm being honest, it's not really about remote at all. There's nothing magical about your spare bedroom that makes you more productive. It's about autonomy. It's about being able to decide where you do your work. And when I look at predictions are, what's the Yogi Berra line? Predictions are really difficult, especially ones about the future.
Right.
When I look at kind of where we're headed, future of work, et cetera, I think, you said 3%. I think we're going to see that number double in terms of remote work most of the time. In other words, probably 10% or fewer, somewhere between 6 and 10% of the workforce, the knowledge workforce, will be remote the majority of the time. Your average employee, though, will be working from not the office much more often. You see this in pre-pandemic research too. Like I go back to the Gallup's 2020 State of the Workplace survey, which was either conveniently or inconveniently timed it was released in early February 2020, right? So it's the 2020 State of the Workplace survey that really didn't capture any of what most of our 2020 experience was like. Instead, it was using 2019 data around engagement. And what it showed was that people were most engaged when you break it down by what percentage of time they're in the office. The people who were most engaged spent 60 to 80% of their time out of the office. Wow. So in other words, not I just want to work from my house forever. I want to be able to come to the office when I need to be there. And I want to be able to hide from all of the distractions of the office when I don't want to be there. In other words, I want autonomy over the job. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we're headed for a whole lot more virtual, or what we might call remote teams. That means we're headed for a lot of hybrid, right? Which is the big kind of buzzword people are using right now. But I don't even like to think of it as hybrid. It should be the norm, which is that the office is here for you when you need to be there, but you can work wherever you want. We're not running a factory anymore. We don't really need you to punch in and punch out, et cetera. You have your objectives, et cetera. And when our resources can support you, great. And when they're a distraction, we trust that you'll go somewhere where you're going to work. Now, that does mean that a lot of the stuff we may have learned to hate, Zoom meetings, for example, they're going to be a permanent fixture moving forward. The idea that on any given day, the majority of your team, or at least several members of your team, aren't in the office with you, that's going to be a reality moving forward too. What I'm probably more excited about, though, is the idea that for a larger organization, we're going to be less tied to putting teams together for certain projects based on location. Like, I'm really excited about the idea that now that we've all tried this for almost 2 years, we know if the best people for a certain project are in our Cleveland, our Houston, and our San Francisco office, we can still just put that team together. We don't need to find people just from the Houston office, for example. And that has some really exciting potential for team-based productivity moving forward as well.
Well, yeah, that pretty much eliminates geographic restrictions, right? So if you can bring people together, regardless of where they are or working, even better to allocate those resources. Let's talk a little bit about those 5 elements of team culture that you identified that explains how the best teams became the best teams. So their dependability, their structure, clarity, and meaning, those are the 4. The 5th one you spend extra attention on, and that's that psychological sense of safety, which everyone's talking about. Everyone's hearing different pieces of it. I love to know how you define it and the 2 pieces of it, which I really like how you do that with trust and respect. If you could go into that, that would be great as well.
Yeah. So I define it pretty similar to how Amy Edmondson defines it, which is it's the extent to which team members feel safe to take risks. And sometimes speaking up when you disagree is a risk. Sometimes trying a new way of doing something when it's not the norm, it's not how we've always done it before, is a risk. Sometimes offering somebody feedback is a risk, right? And sometimes putting out that crazy idea is a risk. But the idea is people feel safe. Amy also categorizes it, and this is the two elements, that you get there by a kind of shared feeling of trust and respect. And those are two different things. We kind of feel like, right? But I like to think of trust and respect as sort of the two different, like one's on the front of the risk and one's on the back of the risk. If I trust the group enough, I will take that risk of speaking up. I will take the risk of submitting that crazy idea, et cetera. And then depending on how the group or the team leader responds, if I feel respected, it's because I feel heard. It's because I feel considered. It may not mean people agree with me, but I at least feel that my opinion was respected as something more than just an outlier, or something more than, oh yeah, we tried something similar to that before,
Right.
that'll never work, et cetera, right? And it creates this combination of trust and respect, by the way, creates either a virtuous cycle where psychological safety compounds and increases, or a vicious cycle where it decreases, right? Because when that first person takes the risk on a team and does something a little bit different, makes themselves a little bit vulnerable, how the team responds with respect affects whether or not everybody else feels trusted enough, is trusting enough to take said risks, whether or not they feel respected, and on it goes. So that's the reason I spent so much time breaking that kind of down, is because I think we spend an awful lot of time, ever since psychological safety became a popular term, talking about, we want ideas, we want people to speak up. We spent a lot of time trying to build up the trust piece without realizing that how we respond to the trust piece matters a whole lot more going forward, about whether or not people actually do trust their leadership. My favorite question, like my default question, remote team or hybrid or in-person team, when I'm working with leaders to gauge on this, is, when was the last time someone disagreed with you publicly? Right? If it was just a couple weeks ago and you can remember it, like, great, right? If it's months ago, that's a problem, right? If it's months ago and you still remember it vividly, that's a problem too, but it's a different kind of problem, right? So when was it, right? When was the last time somebody spoke up and disagreed with you and the leadership perfectly? It's a really great litmus test for just how much safety there is on that team.
And I love how you put it pretty simply with trust and respect. If I trust you, it means that I'll be open with you when you share. If you respect me, it means you value what I share. So I think that's well stated and simply put. Moving on to the issue really of loneliness, which we find that a lot with remote workers. It's the most frequently reported emotion by them, and it can have a significant impact on them and on their well-being. You even put in your book that it can reduce a person's lifespan by the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day or drinking more than 6 alcoholic beverages per day if you experience loneliness from having weak social connections. So what are some effective ways that remote workers can develop these connections, since they're not connected now in the office?
Yeah. So, it's interesting thinking about in that book, the needs of the moment and the needs moving forward, right? To some extent, this 60 to 80% of the time, or 2 or 3 days at the office, 2 or 3 days not at the office, is going to help alleviate some of this. But the truth is, I think what contributes to a lot of it is that we actually this is a controversial take, I know, we got too efficient when it came to remote work. Like, I know we're in too many Zoom meetings, but one of the reasons we're in too many of them is they're running really efficiently. In other words, we're hitting the agenda, we're ending on the scheduled time, not always ending when we've actually figured it out, right? Just ending on the scheduled time. And we're not creating those unstructured moments where people build bonds. If you think about the office environment, you built bonds with your coworkers. We used to call it water cooler talk, or who has a water cooler anymore? In the kitchenette, right? Or in the conference room. We'd schedule a meeting at 10 a.m. and people would start to trickle in 9:45, 9:50, 9:55. And what would they talk about? They wouldn't talk about work. They might ask one random question, but it was, how was your weekend, right? How are the kids? Did you watch any movies, et cetera? And we'd look for all of those sort of things. And we know this from, I'm really indebted to research from Jessica Methat at Rutgers University, who talks a lot about this concept of multiplex ties, or what's sometimes called uncommon commonalities. Those types of conversations allow us to discover things we have in common with other people that we work with, that maybe the uncommon in the commonalities is maybe the whole company doesn't have that in common, just you and I do. And as a result, we feel a little more bonded together. And the interesting thing that happens is that those uncommon commonalities, those multiplex ties, they become the beginnings of friendships. Friendships make you more productive, more engaged. They reduce those feelings of loneliness, right? Interestingly enough, in a co-located environment, those same relationships can stress you out a bit more, because it's hard to blur the line between work and life when you're working with your friends. But in a remote environment, that blurred life actually helps you feel better connected. So it reduces that loneliness as well. But we don't do that. right? We jump on, maybe we allow for 1 or 2 minutes for other people to get connected, and remember to click the little blue join audio button too. And then we hit the agenda. And then when the meeting is over, let's say it's the top of the hour and we're all supposed to run off to our next meeting, you just get that meeting has been ended by host thing, and that's it. And so you don't get that time to build it. Now, how do you, knowing that's what's causing it, how do you negate that? Well, I advise a lot of leaders to be less efficient with their meetings. Maybe if a meeting's scheduled for 10 a.m., jump on Zoom at 9:50 or Teams at 9:50. Send a quick email and say, hey, I'm running early, if anyone is, right? If you're just an individual contributor, if you're just trying to get kind of more connected, just take some time when you're doing one-on-one calls or exchanging emails with it, but just put a little bit of personality back into it so that you can discover those other facets of somebody's personality, find those uncommon commonalities, and turn those things into friendships.
Well, I love one of the tools that you share in your IMS sessions, Fika. Could you just talk a little bit about Fika and how that would be used in this case?
Fika is one of my favorite rituals. So Fika is a Swedish word. For those of you that are like, why are they suddenly speaking Swedish? I mean, if you speak Swedish, you already know this. It translates as to have coffee, like it's just getting a coffee break with somebody. But it's so much more than that in the Swedish tradition, right? It's much more about pulling away from the day, focusing in on the 1 or 2 people that you're getting coffee with, having that conversation, that deeper, that non-work conversation, that catching up on life conversation. And, before the pandemic, when there were only a handful of really, really like 800 to 1,000 plus geographically dispersed companies or remote first companies, I used to say, I don't know a single one that doesn't do some form of Fika, right? If you were pre-pandemic remote first company, you might not call it Fika, but you have some program that people can opt into to get that experience. So most companies, like Help Scout is where I first heard the name Fika. At Help Scout, it's every Wednesday afternoon, you opt into it, you get randomized to meet with another person. You jump on a video call with them for about 30 minutes. You get seeded questions, those uncommon commonality questions about habits and hobbies and background and all that sort of stuff. And so you literally are taking a coffee break with another person, talking about non-work activities and building those uncommon commonalities. Now, one thing I think is fun, if you're watching this and you're like, gosh, this sounds awfully familiar. If your team is already using Slack, the tool Slack, there's actually a plugin now called Donut that basically just does that, just randomizes people who are together in that Slack channel to that, seeds them questions, et cetera. So that's worth checking out as well.
Great. And that leads great into my next question regarding asynchronous and synchronous communication and how asynchronous really should be the default setting, right? But whether it's email or communication tools like Slack, if they're open and accessible too much to your employees and they're expected to respond too quickly, then it seems like these chat applications have replaced really email as the biggest focus stealers, right? How can they avoid having that be the focus? I mean, what practices could they put into place so that they're not continually distracted, right, with this form of communication?
Yeah, okay. So I just have to be vulnerable here for this audience. This is sort of the evolution of Dr. David Burkus in some capacity. So in 2016, I wrote a book called Under New Management, and one of the chapters in that book is about companies that banished internal email because it was so distracting and people had to feel like they were always on, et cetera. And in speeches, as that book came out and in podcast interviews, et cetera, I actually got really excited about tools like Slack. The idea behind a tool like Slack is we're going to put all of your email communication in one app that you have to open. You have to deliberately go to it in order to tap into all that communication. What's happened since then? It's become just another push notification device. So it's doing the same thing your email box is doing, which is anytime someone sends you a message, it's pinging you unless you go in there and default. And that's really the problem, right? The single best thing I think most teams could do that if they're collaborating remotely is have a conversation about what mediums of communication and what topics lend themselves better to asynchronous or synchronous communication. What lends itself better to actually talking in person, like in a meeting, and what could be, hey, whenever it's right for you to jump into the conversation, et cetera, so we don't distract you is right. If you can do that, like that's big step one. Step two, once we've decided that, is shut all those notifications down. Make that communication a place where you have to deliberately go to in order to tap into, instead of something that's tapping on your shoulder. The research on this is really, well, to be honest with you, it's depressing. On average, when somebody's in deep focus and they get interrupted, it takes 21 minutes to get their focus back to the level it was. And your Slack and your email and all of those other asynchronous tools that were supposed to be asynchronous Now they operate synchronously and they ping you every 5 minutes or so, right? Even if it's 10 minutes, even if it was 15 minutes, think about that, right? If it's pinging you every 15 minutes and it takes 21 minutes to get back to focus, well, that's why you never got back to focus that day. And that's why you're ending the day with like, man, I got a lot done today, only to realize that all you've done is cleared out your email inbox and cleared out all those notifications on Slack and not actually done any deep work.
I couldn't agree more. There's lots of great books. I really enjoy the one about from Cal Newport with deep work. I mean, he has a great whole model and framework around that. Let's talk a little bit about synchronous then and communication. And really what I found fascinating with one of the research studies in your book is the findings that state that vocal cues are more critical to accurately judge emotions than facial expressions.
Yeah.
That can be assessed easier when listening to audio or recording. So you may want to ditch those video calls, right? And just use old school tech like phone calls to achieve more communication in less time.
Yeah, right. These things actually make phone calls. I know because one of them came in right as we kicked off and I had to shut it off real fast. And we forgot that. Here's what I'll say for most teams, for most leaders, is that when you've got a team-wide meeting, video is probably still best. It is easier to coordinate who's going to speak and pick up on some nonverbals that are meant to keep the team kind of in sync. But for emotional empathy, for empathic listening, for understanding what's really going on, in other words, for your one-on-ones, your check-ins with individual employees, especially if you're, concerned about burnout and things like that, which is another common question. Believe it or not, the research is strongly supportive that a voice-only call, it makes you have to kind of listen in a bit harder. It makes you have to pick up on stuff. And truthfully, I think some of this is that we've been trained to use this, right? We used this growing up. Our parents, our grandparents, right? It's about 100-year-old device. So we've had some experience on how to kind of listen in on a phone call. Right. And the truth is, the first time for most of us that video calling came in, it was actually still on this device. And it was like, oh my gosh, isn't this cool? And we had like the world's worst, information wise, the world's worst conversation where we just talked about how cool it was that we could see each other. Right. So we're new at that video tool as well. So, my thing is, if you've got multiple people, let's say more than probably stick with the Zoom, but give yourself a break from staring at your camera and staring at your screen. And when you're doing your one-on-ones with people, schedule that as just a phone call. Even better, schedule that as a phone call where you get outside. I mean, depending on whether or not it's warm this time of year and where you live, for some of you, it's like, don't get outside. It'll be -40 soon. But depending on where you live, get outside for those phone calls too. Right. And breathe in some fresh air, go walking, kind of recreate the walk and talk that we know from other research is really effective. Those two are a powerful combination for those one-on-ones, those check-ins, those kind of calls.
Well, I like the mantra you put in your book: work first, voice second, video later. So yeah. I think that's a good policy to follow. Yeah. Well, I can't. So we've talked about it or kind of danced around a little bit throughout the conversation. So before we conclude, I want to talk a little bit about burnout and distractions, both of which are even more present in this day and age. Trying to limit these distractions is really key to our culture, right? I mean, there's an endless amount of them. The key to doing deep work is to be able to focus, to concentrate on something over a long period of time without having any distractions. And in some cases, it's easier at home. And in other cases, it's more difficult being at home when you have children or a family or other distractions in the home environment that you don't have in a work environment. So love to hear your thoughts regarding that and some tips people can use to hopefully have less distractions, right? But really help them with burnout if there's a way to do that. Because I know that the business hours, right? It's hard to set boundaries when you're always working from home because, I just got one more thing to do, one more email to answer. I'm just going to do it real quick. Yeah.
So the problem, it's funny, you said the B word, boundaries, right? And that's what everybody's sort of been preaching. I like to think of it a bit differently. The problem is not necessarily boundaries. The problem is friction. In other words, there is no friction. It's too easy to slip in and out of work mode and non-work mode. So I think we need to think about the ways we could add friction back into that. The commute used to be a huge piece of friction for us, right? That ritual of driving 15 or 90 minutes, depending on where you lived, into work and out of work, or riding on the train or what have you, used to be kind of a ritual that added some friction. We don't have that anymore, right? Our commute is like 10 steps to the spare bedroom. But if you can add it back, you can go you can build out some better, you can adhere to those boundaries a bit better. So for example, and I started working mostly from home before the pandemic. One of the things that we did, and we still do it, is that we pulled our kids off the school bus and we just decided to drive them in every day, which is just fun because I get to, have that time with them. but also like I leave my house, I drive 7 minutes to drop them off at school, and then I drive home, and the drive home becomes my commute to work, right? And then I work so that's become a way to do it. I also, for a long time, I experimented with, I was going to grab both of them, but I only have one of them down here because I'm practicing what I'm preaching. I have 2 different devices. So I have my phone that has work-related stuff on it. And then upstairs in our house where our charging station is an iPad that is only like entertainment, Kindle, Netflix, a game I play all the time, and like a personal Facebook, and that's it. Now, I could always run back downstairs and grab my phone, but that little bit of friction helps me actually keep those boundaries, right? And so I think, we've been thinking about boundaries for a while and trying to get stuff scheduled and what have you, but the big dilemma of the last 2 years has been that there isn't any friction as well. And so that, you asked, well, what could we do to help eliminate some of those things? I don't think we can eliminate, right? Or get less distractions. I think the best thing we can do is make it harder for them to interrupt us by adding more friction and more difficulty to what it would take to succumb to said distraction.
I agree with you. And I've tried to incorporate some of those tools that you put in your book as well to create different zones in my home where I work versus play, and to batch some of the tasks, right? So maybe the first 90 minutes of the day, you're just focusing on emails, and you're kind of using that as a guideline as well. And yeah, and I have yet to find anything that's foolproof, but like you said, I love how you say it's not about boundaries, it's more about the friction. So as we reach the end of today's episode, I kind of wanted just to end on a call to action. So I wanted to kind of turn that over to you, David, to see what could you tell our listeners based on what we talked about today? What are some actions they could take if they're a remote leader or a remote team member that they could use and employ to make them more effective?
Yeah, well, I'll be honest, as we're recording this, I'm thinking a lot about the future of work looks like. We all have almost logged 2 years worth of an experiment in remote work. Now's really the time to start studying yourself, and not everybody's trying to decide how remote they want to be based on days. And the truth is, it's much more about tasks. The key to running hybrid effectively, whether it's a leader of a team or whether you're just individual, is study yourself and study what tasks lend themselves better to you being in the office, you being at home, or you being in some third space as well. Now's the time to really kind of study, not at the number of hours, not at the which days, but actually your tasks. Which different parts of your job function best where, and get that data now. Now, whether your company has a return to office plan or whether you just know that you don't want to or want to, et cetera, you'll be in a much better position if you've got the data from studying yourself and how you prefer to work. And now's the time to be doing that.
Thank you very much for your time today, Dr. David Burkus, and sharing your insights and experience, and remind us and our listeners how they can contact you if they want more information.
Yeah, well, I was fortunate enough to be born with a weird last name, Burkus, Burkus. And so davidburkus.com was open. It's the same on all of the socials except TikTok because I don't dance. So reach out to me. If you're listening to this, reach out to me anywhere there.
Thank you again, and thank you for your time today. This concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found on both Apple and Spotify, and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website, which is ims-online.com. Remember, it's not what you know, it's what you do consistently that makes a difference. See you next time.